Stay away from the door, Jill. I'm gonna kick this door down.
Hurry! This way!
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry...
Happy Halloween, everyone! I am the Kaiju no Kami from the Toku and Animation News Network, and today we're going to be concluding Halloween month with a look at the Resident Evil franchise. The Resident Evil franchise, or Biohazard, as it is known as in Japan, has become a staple of pop culture. From a plethora of video games to movies, books, comics, and spin-offs, there is so much to talk about. So much, in fact, it is hard to cover it all in just one video. Let's see how this goes. Back in 1989, a Japanese film and video game adaptation to a story called Sweet Home was released. It featured a film crew entering a haunted house and encountering, well, ghosts! The video game followed the same setup but featured multiple endings that depended on which character survived in your playthrough. In 1993, Capcom tasked Shinji Mikami to remake the video game adaptation of Sweet Home for modern audiences. This decision puzzled Mikami, as he disliked horror due to his hatred for being scared, but he was told that was exactly what made him the man for the job, as he understood what fear was. Sweet Home ended up evolving into an entirely new IP, as Mikami decided he wanted to add some action-adventure elements into the game, turning it into what would become known as the father of survival horror. This new game featured a batch of zombies due to Mikami's admiration for George Romero's Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead, on top of his disappointment for Dawn's Italian sequel Zombie 2. It would be revealed that the zombies came from a virus that a pharmaceutical company named Umbrella had been working on, along with a variety of other manufactured monstrosities the world had never seen at the time. This led to it being titled Biohazard. However, due to an American metal band using the name Biohazard and another video game with the word in its title, Capcom had to rename the game in America, calling it Resident Evil, due to its setting being within the confines of a mansion on the outskirts of Raccoon City. I remember learning about the first Resident Evil game through a video game review show on TV, though I do not remember the name of it. They briefly talked about the game, and it sounded cool despite my not having a PlayStation at the time. Then in 1997, that changed. I used my birthday money to buy a PlayStation, and several months later, Resident Evil 2 hit shelves. I rented it over its first weekend and loved the hell out of it, but I was unable to complete it in the 3 days you were allowed to keep video games for at the time. I saved up money and picked up the first Resident Evil a good month before my birthday to ensure I would have enough time to complete it before then. It was an interesting game with a lot of memorable tidbits despite its terrible voice acting that has become a joke in itself over the decades.
Hey, what is this? There's a page missing.
Yeah, I thought about that too. Perhaps that was the most important part.
What? Oh! Oh no! Sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
You must be from the Bravo team.
Yes, I'm Rebecca. Rebecca Chambers. I'm a newcomer. I just joined the Stars Bravo team last month.
Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
Pretty much a master of unlocking.
It also featured some frustrating pieces as I lost my head in my first encounter with the lizard beast codenamed the Hunter. Anyway, I finished both campaigns of the game, which allowed you to play as either Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine, two cops from a special police force, and was ready to tackle its sequel, which I did indeed receive on my birthday. I spent the whole summer of 1998 playing the game over repeatedly ad nauseum. It instantly became my favorite game of the time, and one that would be neck and neck with Super Metroid in my replay count. Resident Evil 2 revolved around Chris's sister Claire and a rookie cop named Leon S. Kennedy, both of whom found themselves swarmed by zombies as Raccoon City became an infestation for the undead. The first Resident Evil story was altered depending on which character you were playing as, and while that would repeat itself here, it would also feature an A and B scenario for each character that occurred simultaneously. If you played Leon A, the Claire B scenario would unlock in playing that one. You would see what Claire was doing while you were Leon. The same happened with Claire A and Leon B, which is the canonical scenario, and there were even items that you could leave behind in the A game that the character in the B game could access. It was a pretty cool mechanic and allowed for a lot of replayability. Of course, none of that would have mattered had the story and gameplay not have been equally gratifying. All of this was made possible because Shinji Mikami quit the title when 2/3 of the game had been completed, and he was quickly replaced by one Noboru Sugimura. Toku fans should be quite familiar with Sugimura, for he was the man who wrote a good portion of Kamen Rider Black, the Super Sentai series Jew Ranger, Die Ranger, Kaku Ranger, and O Ranger, and the Metal Heroes shows G-Bomb, Windspectre, and Soul Brain. He would also later go on to write the Onimusha trilogy before his untimely demise in 2005. With that said, Sugimura scrapped the entirety of Resident Evil 2 and started the game over from scratch, which led it into being the worldwide phenomenon it became. Sugimura's efforts are why Resident Evil is still going strong to this very day.
What was that? Something's wrong. Let's check it out. Over there! Shoot it! Eat this, you freak! The zombies aren't stopping it! What is this thing? Hurry! What is this thing? Fire! Fire! You son of a...
Resident Evil 3 Nemesis came out a year later, which featured the return of Jill Valentine, also trying to escape from Raccoon City after its zombie infestation. This new entry gave players a few areas of options that would affect their playthrough, often revolving around a new enemy who would hunt Jill throughout the game called Nemesis. It also showed us there would be no hope for Raccoon City as it is decimated via a nuclear missile at the end.
It's time to go.
Interestingly enough, Nemesis was apparently not actually planned to be the third game in the series, rather a side story, while the real sequel was in development for the upcoming Sega Dreamcast. That one, which would become titled Code Veronica, featured Claire still looking for her brother, only to find herself taken prisoner by the Umbrella Corporation and being sent to an island base, only for yet another zombie outbreak to occur. The game also suffers from what I call the Claire paradox.
I've got to contact Leon and tell him to let my brother know he's being monitored. It's a good thing I have access to an outside connection from here.
Well, that file shows the latitude and longitude of this place. Why don't you send your brother the coordinates and ask him to come help?
Thanks, I'll do that.
Hold on, let me get this straight. She went out to search for her brother, not knowing where he is, gets captured, but then can contact Leon because Leon knows where her brother is and wants Leon to contact her brother to tell her brother where she is. That's just stupid. Let's just move on. Code Veronica brought Albert Wesker back, who was a cop revealed to be an Umbrella scientist at the end of the first one and thought dead. The game ended with Chris and Claire's reunion, vowing to take down Umbrella. This left me anticipating the next title for quite some time, only to find myself disappointed with Resident Evil 4. Kicked off a new storyline that did a time jump with Umbrella having been dismantled off screen. To say Resident Evil 4 was bad would be a lie, as it was an incredible game. At the time I proclaimed it as the greatest Resident Evil ever made. However, times did change, as did my taste, and I started to find myself returning back to my love for Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 4 is the greatest HP Lovecraft game never made. Go read a couple of Lovecraft stories that revolve around villages full of crazed inhabitants if you are unsure as to what I mean. Hell, check out the 2001 film by Stuart Gordon on Dagon, as it feels like Resident Evil 4 beat for beat. The biggest thing Resident Evil 4 did to the franchise was cut back on its horror roots and move it towards a more action-oriented experience. That typically may not have been a bad thing, especially given how many games there were by that point. Nevertheless, each installment after 4 seemed to cut back on the horror for a more streamlined experience, with Resident Evil 6 being the worst offender. Oh, come on now. Who doesn't play Resident Evil for all those great action set pieces, like fighting the giant Brumach-esque creatures to motorcycle chase scenes?
Hold on as tight as you can, okay?
Resident Evil 6 accomplished something no other Resident Evil had done before. It made me hate Resident Evil. Resident Evil 6 felt like it had way too many cooks in the kitchen, and since none of them could agree on a specific direction for the game, Capcom allowed every one of them to have a piece of the action with their own style. What's sad is I actually thoroughly enjoyed the game before it. Resident Evil 5 was not perfect by any means. It had even less horror in it than 4 did, yet it was such a fun game to play, especially if you were playing co-op with a friend. The AI partner does suck. There are ways to work around that aspect. I know many friends who said they hated how quickly Sheva would use up ammo and healing items, but that is not a problem if you don't let her hold them. I always found it best to give Sheva the key items to keep in her inventory while keeping the ammo and healing items in mind and only giving her bullets when she needed them. I also tended to keep her with a handgun while I used the more powerful guns, especially in the early sections of the game. This reduced a lot of frustration on my playthroughs, which helped immensely. Resident Evil 6, on the other hand, was just awful. Part of the problem with Resident Evil 6 was the movies. The movies ended up being big moneymakers for Capcom and Sony, so much so that each installment tried to be bigger than the last one, which made for a messy experience. The first film in what is known as the Alice series, as Mila Jovovich played a movie-exclusive character named Alice, who was the main star of them, had a lot of action-oriented scenes. In the film's defense, all of the game sequels at the time had featured a lot of heavy action set moments themselves, so the first film was mimicking that. Fortunately, it still had a bit of horror to it and was overall an entertaining experience. The soundtrack was damn amazing, all thanks to a brilliant Marilyn Manson. At least at the time, when he knew how to write good music. Then came the second film, Apocalypse, which was based directly on Resident Evil 3 while making Jill a secondary character so Alice could show her up. It still had a lot of good moments in it, and it was cool to see Nemesis on screen even if it wasn't perfect. Then they did something weird. At the end, the movie went all Parasite Eve with Alice, which was an interesting turn of events. It had me pondering where they were going to go with this, only for that thing called extinction to happen. For some dumbass reason, Paul Anderson felt the need to go Mad Max on the movies and have the entire world infected with the T-virus. It's kinda hard to come back from a post-apocalyptic world, so the rest of the movie series had no choice but to continue this trend, even though you could tell even Anderson himself was struggling with this notion, given how they started to use holographic cities and the like to simulate the world before the infection. In Extinction, Alice comes across an entire clone army of herself, and it left off teasing that the next one was going to encompass some big showdown between her and Wesker.
Expect results within 1 month.
Oh, you won't have to wait that long, boys. 'Cause I'm coming for you. And, I'm gonna be bringing a few of my friends.
Honestly, I was kind of excited. Ever since they turned Alice into Parasite Eve, I had wanted to see her face off against Wesker given he had superpowers of his own. And then in the next film, her powers are wiped out in the first 20 minutes, reverting her back to normal.
All those powers of yours? Speed, strength, accelerated healing? Well, you can kiss all those goodbye.
At least in name only, as she maneuvered around everything as if she was still imbued with the T-virus abilities. Afterlife, as the fourth film was titled, did have some solid moments as it was hands down the best looking 3D movie I had ever seen in theaters. Was accompanied by a fantastic soundtrack, and the action scenes were solid overall. I really dig the bullet time action even if it was rather pointless. Sadly, the ending left a lot to be desired, and Chris and Claire really got the shaft in both storytelling and actor-wise. Ali Lauder was kind of a cool Claire, but Wentworth Miller was a complete miscast for Chris. He didn't feel like Chris at all.
I don't know you.
Claire, I'm your brother, remember? What the hell's happened to you?
The worst came when the next film started, which undermined both Redfields, for they completely disappeared into thin air. We never saw Chris again in these movies, while Claire showed up for a pitiful role in the final chapter. The fifth movie, deemed Retribution, gave Alice a daughter for some reason, played by Jovovich's actual daughter, and introduced Ada, Leon, and Barry into the movies.
I'm kind of enjoying myself!
Sadly, like Chris and Claire, they were pretty much there just to say, hey look, you wanted game characters? Well, here you are. Once again, they played second fiddle to Alice, while the movie decided to steal a plot point from the 5th game, having Jill return under the control of Umbrella. The biggest problem with Retribution was just how outright boring it was. The movie killed all of the momentum it had from the end of Afterlife in its first 5 minutes. The best scene from this installment was the opening sequence, where everything is being shown to us in reverse. Actually, besides Chris and Claire, there was another character that just disappeared between movies. Extinction introduced another movie exclusive character who was nicknamed Kmart. Unlike some of the other movie original characters who we saw die on screen, she just vanishes between scenes in the same manner as Chris. She's standing with our gang at the end of Afterlife and then is never heard from again. This would happen in the final chapter as well, with Ada, Leon, Jill, and Alice's daughter, who are just magically gone and never even talked about. Of course, that was the least of the final chapter's worries, as the entire movie was a disorganized mess. From its poorly edited scenes that make you feel like the cameraman was suffering from ADHD, to its convoluted story that adds in a whole new block of plot holes, such as the scientist who was taking orders from Wesker in Extinction being revealed to be Wesker's boss in this one because, hey look everyone, we have an actor from Game of Thrones in our series. And the most sluggish, outright boring pacing of the entire film series with a bullshit ending that just fixes everything. You have what is hands down an entry that matches Resident Evil 6 in being a dumpster fire. Hell, Resident Evil 6 feels competently made compared to the final chapter.
Not cool, man. Not cool.
The movies were such a success that Capcom wanted the games to start mimicking them in the overall design, which backfired on them. Resident Evil 6 was such a failure that they had to go back to the drawing board, which I was okay with. Resident Evil 5 concluded the fight with Wesker, who really became the main antagonist of the series. Therefore, there really was no need for Resident Evil 6 to even exist. The series should have ended with 5, but it didn't. Fortunately, by the time Resident Evil 7 came out, the series returned to its horror roots, giving us a new game with a new engine that returned to a smaller scale and focused on a new character by the name of Ethan Winters. Whereas the franchise originally took its cues from zombie movies, this one followed the themes of Southern comfort horror, a la the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, by setting it on the grounds of a deranged family in Louisiana. Ethan had to fight his way through this family and a bunch of other oddities to save his wife, whom he thought lost. It was an interesting idea, and despite the game being in a first person, it worked out quite well. The Resident Evil series was always a third-person game series, which is what I personally prefer. I have a hard time getting into most first-person games, though it is not an impossibility. As such, I was hesitant to jump into the world of Resident Evil 7 despite it returning to its horror roots. I didn't even actually touch the game until this past summer. What's interesting is the original Resident Evil game was intended to be in first person, only for the decision to be altered thanks to a horror game named Alone in the Dark being released prior to it. Due to that, the decision was made to put Resident Evil in third person, and I am thankful for that. I don't think I would have ventured into the realm of Resident Evil had it been in first person mode back then, as I found first person games hard to play at the time. It wasn't until Metroid Prime that I really started to give games in the first person perspective a chance, and even then, it is still a rarity. Thankfully, I did enjoy Resident Evil 7 quite a lot, even though the enemy variety was subpar. There are these mold creatures that appear in the game, and honestly, they seem to be a bigger threat than they actually are. Often I would shoot their legs off and then just knife them to death like a zombie in the remakes to 2 and 3, because that is all they were. Zombies with a new coat of paint. They only truly become a threat when they attack you in hordes. At least, for the majority of the mold type you encounter in the game. There are some that pose a bigger threat due to how quickly they move, but they only show up occasionally. The 8th installment, Village, plays more akin to Resident Evil 4 than Resident Evil 7, which is a real shame. The game is not bad, but at this point Ethan feels like a Monty Python character than a real person due to how invulnerable he is. In the last game he got his hand cut off by a chainsaw, which was then put back on like nothing had ever happened. In Village, he gets part of his left hand bitten off by a werewolf, gets his arm chopped off yet again, and just walks it off like it is is nothing.
'Tis but a scratch.
He even reattaches his hand at one point. There is a story purpose behind it, but still. Village does have some truly great creepy moments to keep you engaged, especially in a creaking home with what appears to be a living doll creature and a giant demonic baby that looks like something out of Silent Hill. If you do not know what Silent Hill is, Resident Evil's success attributed to the creation of copycats, which in turn meant Resident Evil created a new genre of games called survival horror. Survival horror essentially meant a game that relied on making its players uncomfortable while also keeping their inventory management at stress-inducing levels. You would often have to decide if bringing a gun, or perhaps even ammo, with you was more important over other items. Choosing poorly could mean having to trek back to an item's location or storage box, if there was one, to get that item, which could also be surrounded by unimaginable horror. Many games, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s, also relied on limiting the number of times you could save a game throughout your playthrough. Like the item management, you had to decide if saving at that point in time was a good idea or not, because saving too many times over could result in you running out of the ability to save at later stages of the game. The aforementioned Silent Hill is by far the most successful of the Resident Evil clones, which had a heavy focus on psychological horror rather than the creature feature Resident Evil typically followed. Carrier from the Sega Dreamcast was another contender for the throne, which allows you to play the game as two different characters with similar outcomes as you traverse a cruise ship. There was The Thing, which acted as a sequel to John Carpenter's masterpiece. A game that gives you a dog companion to help you run away from enemies and hide, named Haunting Ground. Obscure was like a video game adaptation of the movie The Faculty. One series that traded in guns for a camera titled Fatal Frame. Dino Crisis, which was Resident Evil but with dinosaurs. And more recently, Alien Isolation. Alien Isolation acted as a direct sequel to the greatest horror film ever made. Along with Shinji Mikami's own The Evil Within series. However, if you wanted to play one of the games I mentioned that isn't named Silent Hill, I highly recommend Carrier. It was glitchy, but it hit all the right notes, even down to its super terrible voice acting.
Hey you! Are you human?
Yeah, I'm Sergeant Ingalls from the Spark team. You're safe.
There's nothing to accomplish here. There's nothing to do but abandon ship.
Calm down. Evacuate to the flight deck. Help is on its way.
There is a lot of media to dive into for Resident Evil if video games aren't your thing. I already talked about the majority of the movies, but the most recent live action film, Welcome to Raccoon City, is really the only one worth checking out if you are curious. It does merge the stories of the first two games into one while making some puzzling decisions in the way characters are portrayed.
Oswald Spencer was the creator of the Umbrella Corporation. And the mansion was his home until the year of his death in... What the fuck are you doing here, Leon?
Still, it is worth watching once as it does have some legitimate moments of suspense and tension going on. It's also fun to spot the references to the games on top of making fun of Brosker.
Hey!
You snooze, you lose.
What?
Still a sandwich now.
Just gotta let it go.
Watch out! What would the worst way to die be?
What?
To be swallowed whole by a snake or eaten alive by a great white shark?
There are also several CGI movies you could check out, though most of them are nearly as bad as the Alice movies, with the exception being the most recent Death Island.
Shit! Yo! Hand over there! Some dude shot some other dude! You see that? What the...
They do take place in the game universe, so you are expected to know who the characters already are. Not that it matters given how they have little to no character development. Like this random lady who looks like she stepped out of a Dead or Alive game. Naturally, there have been a myriad of spin-offs to the games. Back in 2004, Capcom introduced players to Resident Evil Outbreak, which was the first online game for the franchise. Unfortunately, it was outdated as the only way you could communicate with other players was through a type chat at the beginning of the game, or through randomized pieces of dialogue the characters would spout when you flipped the right analog stick. Capcom's reasoning for this was to ensure veterans of the game did not spoil the enjoyment for new players, only for it to backfire on them. And nowadays, you can't even play online anymore due to the servers being shut down, forcing you to play the game with only you and two poorly controlled AI partners who will often ignore you even if you are being attacked. It was an intriguing idea, and being able to play as random citizens of Raccoon City with several locations not found in the main game helped build up the scope of the city before its ultimate fate. The bar from the first game, the hotel, and the zoo from File 2 were my personal favorite scenarios to play through. While it was cool to see the underground lab and RPD stations from 2 with updated graphics, I never found it as cool as those. Then there were some scenarios that just dragged on a bit longer than they should have, with 2 hospital ones that made little sense. One dealt with leeches, while another revolved around an Axeman hunting you down throughout the entire thing as you're trying to find a way to kill a plant infestation. Capcom did eventually try their hand again with online play, with a game that was set in an alternate universe of Resident Evil 2 where you play as Umbrella soldiers who kill Leon and Claire.
You're coming with us.
Claire, I don't want to go! Please, no.
Sorry, we've got orders.
And then once more with some shitty ass thing called Umbrella Corp. As if that wasn't enough, there was a game on the Game Boy Color which took an interesting style of having all combat take place in first person mode, while the game played in third like a Shin Megami Tensei game. Surprisingly, Gaiden was an enjoyable experience, and I would rather replay that one again than say Resident Evil 6. A trilogy called Resident Evil Survivor surfaced, which also played the games in first person. The first one was an absolute chore to get through as the US release removed all of its light gun support, requiring players to use a regular game controller. What was equally annoying is that the story tied to the main games. The second Survivor was an on-the-rails remake of Code Veronica, while a third installment took similar veins to Gaiden. It featured a couple of heroes on a cruise ship that would play in third person until you enter combat, then it would move into first. Umbrella Chronicles and Darkside Chronicles was another spin-off that featured retellings of the older games with some new content via an on-the-rails experience a la the House of the Dead series. more recently, we had the Revelation series, which were set in different time periods. The first featured Jill and Chris before the events of Resident Evil 5, while another starred Barry and Claire. Initially, Capcom advertised these games as continuing the tradition of the classic Resident Evil playstyle, putting horror over action, only for that not to exactly be the case after all. All in all, the Resident Evil franchise has been going on for nearly 30 years, and it seems like Capcom is not ready to let it die. We have had several remakes of older games, which have allowed newcomers to enjoy the stories the games of old had to offer, while updating the gameplay to match modern standards. The original Resident Evil 2 was an instant hit with me, and the 2019 remake was no different. It was everything I could have ever wanted from a remake of Resident Evil 2, although it did have a few mind-boggling hiccups when it came to how the A and B scenarios were handled. Regardless, it is currently my favorite Resident Evil game.
What the hell was...
Just get up here. Can't say I didn't warn you.
You said the virus turned people into monsters, not reptiles.
Fair point.
I also found the remakes to 3 and 4 to be improvements over their originals.
How do you like this?
Thanks.
You're welcome.
What would I do without you, Ada?
Be parasite food?
Many will condemn 3 for deviating a little too much from its original. I had a blast with it, and since I was not the greatest fan of the original game, it didn't bother me as much as it did with others. It doesn't mean it couldn't have been better though.
Now here's a weird fucking door.
Leave it. We're here for Bard.
Bitch can't even swim.
In all this excitement, I forgot to mention Resident Evil 0, which was an okay game. In 2002, Capcom released a remake of the first Resident Evil game that expanded on the original while upping the fear factor intensely. Resident Evil 0 was meant to be a prequel to the first story and featured Rebecca with a new character named Billy, which seems quite odd given how inexperienced and oblivious Rebecca appears to be in the first game. It introduced a new mechanic of being able to switch between characters and trading items with each other. Like with the Outbreak duology, it was an intriguing idea that didn't gel well in practice, leaving even more backtracking than the other entries before it. The Resident Evil franchise has its ups and downs, with some of those downs being extremely frustrating. Even still, I find myself unable to truly leave it for good, no matter how pissed off I am at it. If you have never played a Resident Evil game before, now is the perfect time to do so, with the vast majority of them being available on one console. And with that said, another Halloween month comes to an end. I hope you've enjoyed this month. Until next time, bye! There was a Netflix live action series, but we don't talk about that.